My name is Michael Simpson, and I'm the Director of Visual Arts at the Lowry in Salford. I'm sorry if you were perhaps expecting my colleague Claire Stewart, who I think was advertised to give this talk. Unfortunately, she's come down with COVID and is laid low, and as she says herself, she wouldn't be a pretty sight if she tried to give the tour. So or this talk. So I'm going to do it, if that's all right, and talk for the next half an hour or so about the Lowry collection, named after L.S. Lowry, whose dates were 1887 to 1976. So he was born, it's a hell of a span. He was born in the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, and he died, I think, just a year shy of Queen Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee. So an extraordinary span. But in that time, although his work, that the range of his work was enormous, actually much more than people give him credit for, actually he was really consistent throughout all that time in terms of what he was trying to do with his work. The building that you're looking at now in this slide is the Lowry in Salford, not in Manchester. We always remind people Manchester's the little place up the road. We're Salford. And the building was one of the Millennium projects. So opened in 2000, one of the few surviving Millennium projects. There were a number, obviously, that were that opened in 2000. But very few are still with us. Very glad that the Lowry is. And it was driven, the whole concept of the building was driven by having the Lowry collection come into it. The collection itself, which is owned by the people of Salford, it's Salford's collection, numbers a few, I think it's something like 300 or 400 paintings, drawings and watercolors and so on. The collection was originally put together by the curators at Salford Museum and Art Gallery starting after the Second World War. And they developed the collection and it was shown at Salford Museum and Art Gallery, which is only about 10 minutes up the road. But then it was, as I say, the collection was used as the starting point for this extraordinary new building on the banks of the Ship Canal. And you know, for a major venue like this in Salford, three major theatres, a huge suite of art galleries was a great achievement, really, and I'm always proud that the Lowry collection was at the heart of it. What I'm going to do is focus on 6 key works that Claire Stewart, the curator of the collection, has chosen, and talk about those. And I think what they do is give a really good sense of the variety of L.S. Lowry's work, and that's very much what I'm hoping you'll get to see this evening. First work, though, is one of his absolute classic works, Market Scene Northern Town, painted in 1939. There's a few things in here that are apt that really do make this a classic work by L.S. Lowry. The first is obviously the coming together of all these different people. Lowry loved a focal point. So many of his paintings, particularly, it has to be said, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, so many of his paintings have something that's bringing people together in the city. And that might be a marketplace, as in this picture, or it might be a bandstand in a park, or it might be a punch up in the street. Things that brought people together is what attracted Lowry to it. And then he would just love painting these crowds. And his crowds, there's kind of characters within there, but they're always fairly anonymous people. It's almost like they're extras on a stage set, I think. And a lot of the way the work is painted also gives that sense of it being a bit of a stage set. This is also a great example of how Lowry pretty much primarily employed 5 colours: ivory black, vermilion, Prussian blue, yellow ochre, and flake white. And he would always, for his paintings, he would always put down these really strong layers of white and then build up on them, but using these 5 colors really as the basis for what he was looking to do. I think it's really interesting that he calls this picture Market Scene Northern Town. That's his title. Northern Town, he's not trying to make it a specific location. Basically, this is just the life. This is just people's everyday lives around him. And I think what Lowry loved to focus on was the ebb and flow of people's daily lives. Yes, he was painting a particular sort of landscape, a factory landscape, an industrial landscape, but actually they are almost always, they are the backdrop to people just living their lives, getting their tea of an evening, or queuing up at a fish and chip shop, or going to the pub, whatever it might be. Lowry was primarily interested in painting just ordinary people leading ordinary lives, whatever they might be. It's actually based on a real market, though, in Pendlebury, which is in Salford, which was not far from where he lived, where his home was. But as I say, it's not an accurate view. Just as a little sidebar, here's another work by Lowry showing a market, the Flatiron Market. This is much earlier, about 1925. Work on paper. Lowry is very well known for his paintings, but actually we have loads of really fantastic works on paper by him, usually pencil, often sometimes pencil and chalks, as we've got here, occasionally watercolors, and I'll show you one of those a wee bit later. And a good number of them come from his the fact that actually throughout most of his career as a painter, he actually had a day job, so to speak, which was as a rent collector for the Pall Mall Property Company. So, and he kept that right up to his retirement. And that would mean him walking the streets of Manchester, Salford mainly, going door to door, collecting rents. And there's lots of photographs, but also kind of reminiscences and memories of Lowry actually stopping at street corners, taking out a notepad or taking out sometimes an artist pad and doing drawings. And this may well be something that he started in that way. As I say, it's in chalks with a little bit of pencil. It's relatively topographically accurate, this work. But as I say, he wasn't always like that. So for instance, here's just another little side work. Here you can see a drawing he made of Francis Terrace, which was a small terrace in Salford, drawn in 1956. This was actually part of a commission from Salford Museum and Art Gallery, who commissioned, at that point, were commissioning Lowry to record streets, buildings, houses, terraces that were earmarked for redevelopment. However, it has to be said, Lowry wasn't necessarily someone you could rely on, because that's Francis Terrace, according to L.S. Lowry, and you can see down the Ginnell, and there's houses either side, and right in front of you there are 2 chimneys, one a kind of slightly more domestic chimney and then a great big factory chimney. But actually a photograph of the time, this is the same view down Francis Terrace, from more or less the same period, and those factories didn't exist. So you know, he would play fast and loose. I sometimes think the words kind of artistic license were absolutely made for him. Okay, the second work that we've chosen is The Lake from 1937, an oil painting, quite extraordinary thing, really. Yes, it's another one of Lowry's industrial scenes, but it shows another side to his industrial scenes, and one actually where people are almost absent. You can see a few figures, tiny figures there. It's a blighted, bleak, almost apocalyptic landscape that is painted. And he said something that I always think is fascinating. He says, "I'm attracted to decay, and in a way to ugliness." And a lot of his works, he wasn't shy about painting or drawing people who there's a famous painting by him of a bearded lady that he swore he saw in the street, and he loved different shapes and sizes, and he often painted and drew drunks kind of sprawled out on the benches. Another quote is the thing about painting is there should be no sentiment. It's interesting, when I talk to people who don't really know Lowry, they assume he's a kind of sentimental, nostalgic painter, and he couldn't be further from the truth. And this work, The Lake, shows a big set of stagnant ponds, a stagnant lake. There's rotting boats, there's rotting timbers, there's these smoky skies. The posts in the foreground of the painting almost look like tombstones. And there are just, as I say, these tiny, almost inconsequential people just on the water's edge. Today, and I don't want to read too much into it, but today it feels almost like a reflection of the impact of climate change. And, we know the development of industry, which, Manchester and the Northwest is very proud of, actually, though, has brought us in a long way to where we are now in terms of our concerns about climate change. And this is a work that increasingly I look at and think, it really is brought home. Again, it's not an actual place, it's actually a composite. Lowry would often take like a viaduct, the Stockport viaduct, and he'd put it into a picture, and he'd take a factory from the other side of Manchester and he'd put that in, and he'd find a coal mine workings and he'd put those in. So he was sometimes he was fairly specific, but quite often actually a lot of his work was just a kind of composite coming together. Just looking at this kind of stagnancy, I don't know if that's a word, I've just made it up, this kind of fetid landscape. Here's another, just as a sidebar, here's another drawing by him, the River Irwell in 1924. The River Irwell ran alongside and powered in many ways in the early days a lot of these factories. It was often flooded, it was certainly permanently polluted. As you can see, there's industry everywhere. He never shied away from acknowledging that. And here's a photograph of the River Irwell at around about the same time. So, and I think a few people there. And so again, this was the landscape, this was the environment that people were living their lives in. I had a look, actually, just out of curiosity, in the early 1920s, when Lowry did that drawing, certainly before, there were 230,000 people living in Salford, most of them living alongside this sort of industrial landscape, growing up in this environment, and it constantly just kind of sat over them, I suppose. The third work that we're going to focus on is this, I would say, absolutely fantastic drawing, A View from the Window of the Royal Technical College, Salford, which Lowry drew in 1924. I think it's a wonderful composition. Just as a sidebar, I was always quite conflicted about L.S. Lowry when I was a young student and getting to know art, and so many other artists seemed more exciting and vivid, and then I saw just a couple of works by him, including this one, where I was just so bowled over at this approach to having this chimney totally dissecting the composition in this way, and it felt incredibly modern to me. And we know that Lowry, and I don't want to overclaim anything, but we know Lowry looked at a lot of other work by a lot of artists. He always liked to keep in touch with what else was going. And although this isn't a work that speaks of modernism, of course, it's still, he was interested in modernism. He used to look at it, never made works. He made a couple of works that maybe flitter around the edges of it, maybe. But he was aware, and I think a work like this is, in its own way, is every bit as courageous as as a lot of other work that was being done at the time. Some of you may be scoffing at that, fair dues, but for me it was a really important work, certainly in terms of my engagement with L.S. Lowry. I love this chimney just carving its way through, and it reinforces that sense of dominance of the industrial landscape, and I'm going to make another word up, I think, verticality. I'm making words up here. There's the people milling around, and then above them there are these factories looming over them, and then the smoke, the chimneys coming out the top of the factories, and the smoke coming out the top of the chimneys, and it always feels an incredibly oppressive vertical landscape that's surrounding everybody. And I love with the chimney how he's gone over and over and over it in soft pencil. That really has a kind of, it feels like a chimney that's covered in soot and dirt and so on. It's called View from the Window of the Royal Technical College. Lowry had been attending evening classes at the School of Art, which was based at the Technical College in Salford. Again, something I'm often told by visitors is, oh, Lowry was untaught. He was an untaught artist, and they couldn't be further from the truth. Lowry attended art classes for many, many years, and he first started going to art classes at Salford School of Art in 1915. And this was, as I say, a view from that building. And here's, just as another sidebar, is a view from the opposite side of the building, actually looking over at Peel Park. Peel Park was opened in the mid-19th century, following a huge campaign by MPs and activists who said that, given that Salford was this huge industrial, polluted, smoky, oppressive landscape, the workers, the people needed a green space, and it didn't have one at the time. Prominent amongst the MPs who campaigned for it actually was Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, hence Peel Park. It's a huge campaign. Lots of workers contributed their own money to the fund to build the park. There's some debate about whether it's arguably the world's first genuine public park. I gather Derby also lays claim to that, but it never stops Salford or Manchester claiming first. We do it all the time, I have to be honest. It's Peel Park is something that Lowry returned to a lot. And just want to go on to the next picture. This is the this is still looking at Lowry and the drawings of the park. This is Bandstand in Peel Park, 1925. I said earlier about how Lowry liked to have things that brought people together, focal points. Well, here's a great one. The bandstand with the band playing. I'm sure you can't see in the slide, but when you get up close to the drawing, you can see the conductor conducting the band, and on the inner circle there, you can see everybody dancing and having a lovely time. Sunday afternoon, one presumes, and the outer ring is everybody watching them. As always, as so often with Lowry's work, in the backdrop, there's the factory landscape in the backdrop. But there are these greenhouses in the foreground, and this rather interesting kind of brick wall, which I'm always slightly intrigued by, that Lowry has drawn along the bottom. I don't have a slide of it, but Lowry sometimes employed these brick walls. We have a famous work called Coming from the Mill, where in the foreground there's a horse and cart, and Lowry himself said he couldn't get the horse's legs just right, so he painted a wall in front of the horse's legs. So maybe that's obscuring something else, I don't know. But yes, as I say, Lowry was studying at the Salford School of Art, and he particularly enjoyed doing life drawing. His seated male nude from around about 1914, and we have a huge number of fantastic drawings actually by Lowry. skeletons, bones, anatomical drawings, lots of life models, both nude and clothed. And I'm always very fond of this photograph of him at the costume class. He's the gentleman closest to the model that you can see, very upright and looking towards her. So that was Lowry in his evening class. Some of you may know, while he was studying, he met an artist called Adolphe Villette. And Villette had left France, actually, in slightly mysterious circumstances. There was talk of an affair and things like that, but I don't want to be a gossip. But Villette came over, left France, came to Manchester, came to Salford, started teaching, and Villette was very much imbued by the French Impressionists and how they were looking at the modern city, kind of often Paris and so on, and painting the modern city. And it was Villette really who encouraged Lowry to start looking at the world around him, and Lowry kind of found his subject, so to speak. I want to go on to the fourth work now by Lowry. Again, very different. I'm hopefully showing you a range of his work. Head of a Man, 1938. This is a work that started out as a self-portrait. Lowry described it, but he decided he wanted to make what he described as a grotesque portrait of more of his state of mind, if you like, than his appearance. And 1938 is a crucial year. His father had died in the early 1930s, and his mother pretty much took to her bed for the next, I think, 7-8 years. And Lowry was living at home with her. Today we'd call him a carer, but in those days he was just looking after his bedridden mother. And he would get up and he'd make her breakfast and settle her in her bed for the day. Then he'd go off to work as rent collector at the Pall Mall Company, come home in the evening, sit with his mother, make her tea, and then when she went to sleep, he'd go up to the top room and start painting. Some of you might have seen a film that came out a couple of years ago called Mrs. Lowry and Son, with Tim Spall as L.S. Lowry and Vanessa Redgrave as Lowry's mother, which was just really gave a sense of the claustrophobic relationship. It wasn't necessarily the happiest relationships by all accounts. She was very critical of him being an artist. She didn't think it was the right thing for him to do. She didn't really like his work. 1938, this is an extraordinary insight perhaps into Lowry's state of mind, and that's how he kind of characterized it. There's very direct gaze, very disturbing work in many ways. His mum died in 1939. The same year he had his first one-man exhibition in London. He'd been painting for 20 odd years, to some minor success at times up in the Northwest, but it's a sad fact then and probably now that you need to have an impact in London to really cement your position in the art world. Lowry had his first one-man show in London in 1939, became virtually an overnight sensation actually, and suddenly an artist who'd been pretty much ignored for 20 odd years was suddenly very much in demand. Just out of interest sake, here's a photograph of Lowry from about the same time as that portrait, actually, sometime in the 1930s, a studio portrait, the sort of type that lots will have had. Excuse me. I just want to show you, just as another sidebar, another portrait by Lowry, self-portrait from 1925, a bit earlier. He was in, I think he was in his very late 30s at this point, and very much a kind of northern man, flat cap, Macintosh, and so on. The fifth work out of the six is Seascape, 1952. I have this theory that in 100 years' time, L.S. Lowry will be better known as a maritime painter than he will be as an industrial painter, to be honest. I'll never know if I'm right or not. I'm sure I won't be, but his seascapes are really quite extraordinary. They're much less well-known subject matter, but actually the sea was probably one of the most consistent subject matters that he painted. His earliest works were drawings of yachts off the northwest coast, which is something he returned to. I'll show you one in a second. But then, as I say, his mother died in 39. He became this overnight sensation. Obviously, the Second World War broke out in 39. Lowry came out of it very much mixed in terms of his emotions and his feelings. He was getting lots of success as an artist, but actually he'd been painting these industrial scenes for decades. He was also incredibly honest and open at the time, so this is the early 50s, about his own feelings sometimes of isolation and depression and loneliness. He talked about it. He called it the battle of life, and these works very much kind of articulate that. You have the sky and the horizon and the sea. They're incredibly empty. Some paintings he did would have a little ship in the middle of nowhere, right in the middle of the painting, but he would talk about it, and people are getting better today talking about their emotions and loneliness and depression and so on. So for an artist who was by then becoming a national figure in the early 1950s, to talk about it, make paintings about it, was really quite extraordinary. There's my favorite quote by L.S. Lowry, is "You don't need brains to be a painter, just feelings." And it's a fantastic starting point when I talk particularly to young people. You just need to feel something: hate, love, anger, excitement, whatever it is. Try and put that down on paper or in paint. Lowry described himself as a simple man. There was a famous ballet by Northern Ballet called A Simple Man, but actually he was as complex and as complicated as the rest of us. And I always think these works, you have this very on the surface, literally on the surface, you have this fairly calm, placid sea, but actually we know underneath the surface will be teeming with life and fish and fauna and all that. And it's the same with Lowry. Underneath the surface of Lowry, he was actually a very, very complicated man. When curators at Salford Museum Art Gallery bought this work for the Salford collection, there was a lot of pushback from local councillors who really resented spending, decent money by that point on a work that wasn't, clearly by L.S. Lowry, but actually the Lowry collection has a number of these extraordinary works. And as I say, I think they're going to prevail in terms of his reputation. Just going back to mentioning about how sea is such an important subject for him, just a little sidebar here. This is Yachts, a watercolor from 1959. He didn't really like watercolor. He played around with it, but he, as I say, it was subject matter he returned to a lot. But in terms of that, you don't need brains to be an artist, just feelings. Here's another work called The Lake. We looked at one called The Lake much earlier. This is The Lake, 1951. This is actually the Lake District, but in a way only Lowry could turn the Lake District into this kind of crater-like First World War battlefield. It's a picture that Claire Stewart, the curator, always describes as airless and weatherless and shadowless, and it's a work that speaks again, I think, of Lowry's personal feelings. I want to finish with work number 6, Going to the Match, 1953. This is the first work since the Lowry collection was transferred to the Lowry in 2000. Excuse me. This is the first work that the Lowry itself has gone out to acquire. Some of you might have come across in the autumn that the work was up for auction, and we were trying very hard to ensure that it was going to remain in a public collection. It had actually been on loan to us since 2000. It was bought by the Professional Football Association, and it's going to the match. It's going to a football match, and they immediately lent it to us. So we'd had it on loan for 20 odd years, and every other Saturday afternoon, we have Old Trafford, Manchester United's ground just up the road. We have all these fans home and away come in and have a look at the picture, see themselves in it. But the PFA decided they wanted to sell the painting, and for perfectly good reasons. They wanted, as a charity, they wanted to use the money for other things. And so we launched this campaign, and we were very, very, very fortunate that the Law Family Charitable Foundation stepped forward and were generously gave us the cash to acquire the work at auction, which we did. It's a magnificent painting. I think 1953 actually is when Lowry's at his absolute best. But again, it's absolutely typical of Lowry that he's not interested in the football match. Here again, it's just an excuse to bring people together. He's interested in people coming together. And these were the days when, pretty much every football match would be paid at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. So the factory whistle would go at 12. You'd have time for a pie and a pint, and then you'd all come together. Communities would come together. This was before public transport, really made a difference in terms of people being able to travel to matches. So you'd have much more local community coming to see the match. This is actually Bolton Wanderers' old ground, Burnden Park. So this are Bolton Wanderers fans coming together. And just to let you know, so we've acquired this work, delighted to do that. It's the Lowry collection. And we've acquired this work, and it's going to go out to Bolton Museum and Art Gallery at the end of March for a fantastic exhibition they've got planned about the painting and about Lowry's relationship with Bolton and about the history of Bolton Wanderers and so on. I hope you get the chance to see it. So that's me scooting through my 6 works, and thank you so much for coming along. Thank you. I'll say goodbye.